Everyone is familiar with how the siege of Vienna concluded, and the Winged Hussars relieved Vienna after the largest cavalry charge in history, because it was one of the most famous battles in history. However, not as many people are aware of what occurred at Perchtoldsdorf, so they are not aware of the events that led up to the siege of Vienna, and thus they do not know the full story of the battle. In mid-July of 1683, the Ottoman vanguard of over 150,000 troops on its way to Vienna reached a small fortified town 10 miles south of the city, and Perchtoldsdorf stood in their way because it was a strategic location that controlled access to Vienna. The garrison was small and the walls would not hold. Therefore, the town was in a precarious position and its fate was all but sealed. The Turks asked for their surrender and surrendered peacefully, and you will be pardoned, because the Ottomans wanted to avoid a lengthy siege, and thus they offered the town a chance to surrender without a fight. Your lives are secured and you will be allowed to leave without any harm, so the people of Perchtoldsdorf were given a choice, but it was a false one, because the Ottomans had no intention of keeping their word. The gates were open, and within a few hours almost 3,000 men were slaughtered in the square because the Ottomans saw the town as a threat, and thus they dealt with it ruthlessly. The women and children were chained up and marched off to be sold into slavery because they were seen as spoils of war, and thus they were treated as property, and the town was plundered and burned because the Ottomans wanted to leave no doubt about their intentions. The promise of security counted for nothing because the Ottomans had no intention of keeping their word, and therefore the next day, July 17, 1683, the main Ottoman force arrived before Vienna and the siege commenced, because the Ottomans were determined to take the city. The Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa, demanded that the gates be opened and that the city surrender, because he wanted to avoid a lengthy siege, and thus he offered the city a chance to surrender without a fight. But the population would then be spared because he wanted to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, the commander of Vienna, rejected this demand because he knew that the Ottomans could not be trusted, and thus he decided to defend the city, because it was the only way to ensure the safety of its inhabitants. But inside the walls, Vienna at least had a fighting chance because the city was well fortified, and thus it could withstand a siege, and that decision, made in the shadow of the Perchtoldsdorf massacre, determined everything that came after, because it gave the city a chance to survive, and thus it was a crucial moment in the history of the siege. It's why 16,000 defenders were able to hold out for 2 months against 150,000 Ottoman troops, because they were well led and well trained, and thus they were able to resist the Ottoman army, and it's why the relief army had time to organise and march, because the defenders were able to hold out long enough for the relief army to arrive, and it's why the Winged Hussars were able to make their charge, because the relief army was able to break through the Ottoman lines, and Vienna could not be allowed to fall because it was a strategic location, and thus it was crucial to the fate of Europe. Surrender was not an option because it would have meant the end of the city, and thus the defenders were determined to fight on, and Vienna in 1683 was not just any city, because it was the capital of the Habsburg Empire, and thus it was a symbol of resistance against the Ottoman Empire. The Habsburg capital was the largest city in Central Europe, with a population of around 50,000, but its real importance lay in geography, because it straddled the Danube and was located along vital lines of communication connecting East and West Europe, and whoever controlled Vienna controlled access to the German territories, northern Italy and most of Catholic Europe, and Vienna was a gateway because it was a strategic location that controlled access to the rest of Europe. It was also a bulwark between the Ottoman Empire and further conquest deep into the heart of the continent, because it was a strong fortress that could withstand a siege, and to the Ottomans Vienna was laden with symbolism, because it was a symbol of Christian resistance against the Ottoman Empire, and known as the Golden Apple. Vienna represented the ultimate conquest in the Islamic and Ottoman political mind, because it was a strategic location that controlled access to the rest of Europe. Capturing Vienna would satisfy a centuries-old imperial desire and provide a gateway for further conquests in Europe, because it would give the Ottomans control over the rest of Europe. And it wouldn't be their first try, because in 1529, An earlier Ottoman army led by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent had besieged Vienna, and the siege had ended in failure because the city was well defended, and defences had resisted, and weather and supply lines had conspired against the invaders, and Suleiman had been compelled to retreat, and the attempt had demonstrated Ottoman intent because it showed that the Ottomans were determined to take the city. Vienna remained a target because it was a strategic location that controlled access to the rest of Europe. And the only issue was when they would come back, because the Ottomans were determined to take the city. And by 1683, the time seemed ripe from the Ottoman point of view because the Habsburgs were beset by internal divisions and fighting on multiple fronts, and the monarchy was overstretched, and the Ottoman Empire under Sultan Mehmed IV still possessed considerable military strength. And Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha decided that the moment had finally come, because he wanted to take advantage of the Habsburgs' weakness. Vienna was not only a strategically important fortress because it controlled access to the rest of Europe, but it was the centre of Catholic power in Central Europe, a political as well as a religious icon because it was the capital of the Habsburg Empire, and the loss of Vienna would have serious psychological and strategic consequences because it would give the Ottomans control over the rest of Europe, and the balance of power in Europe would shift, because the Ottomans would be able to expand their empire, and it had to be defended because it was a strategic location that controlled access to the rest of Europe, and it had to be conquered for the Ottomans because it was a symbol of Christian resistance against the Ottoman Empire. Three men dominated the scene in 1683 because they were the leaders of the armies that fought in the siege, and for the Ottomans there was Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, because he was the leader of the Ottoman army and he was the de facto commander of the campaign because Sultan Mehmed IV had granted him extensive powers, and Kara Mustafa was ambitious, confident and prepared to take significant risks because he wanted to take the city. And he convinced the Sultan that Vienna could finally be taken, and staked his own position and security on that pledge because he was determined to succeed. Kara Mustafa's reputation was closely linked to terror because he was known for his brutality, and massacres, enslavement and gratuitous brutality were part of his repertoire because he wanted to inspire fear in his enemies. And Perchtoldsdorf was not an isolated atrocity because it was part of a larger pattern of brutality, and it was a calculated gesture meant to intimidate because he wanted to show the Viennese what would happen to them if they resisted. And that surrender might not save them either because he wanted to break their spirits. On the Habsburg side was Emperor Leopold I because he was the ruler of the Habsburg Empire, and his position was precarious because the Habsburg monarchy was at war on several fronts, and troops and resources were scarce, and Vienna's fortifications had been strengthened gradually, but the emperor had little faith in the city's capacity to resist a lengthy siege by a vast field army. And once the Ottoman advance seemed imminent, Leopold chose to abandon the city because he wanted to save himself, and he fled with the court, most of the nobility and the portable wealth of the state, leaving Vienna to its garrison and citizens because he did not want to risk being captured. The defence of the city was entrusted to Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg because he was a 43-year-old career soldier, and his task now seemed hopeless because the city was surrounded by a large Ottoman army, and he commanded approximately 11,000 regulars, garrison and improvised troops, plus some 5,000 armed civilians and volunteers, because he wanted to defend the city, and a total of about 16,000 defenders could be raised because he wanted to resist the Ottoman army. The walls of Vienna were built upon earlier medieval fortifications, but reinforced with earthworks and bastions because they were designed to withstand a siege, and they were massive, but not yet fully adapted to withstand a siege of such magnitude, because the city was not prepared for an army of that size, and facing them was an Ottoman army of over 150,000 men, because it was a large and well-trained army, and it comprised elite janissaries, Sipahi cavalry, Tatar horsemen, artillery and engineers, because it was a well-equipped and well-trained army, and this army had already marched through Hungary, defeating opposition and leaving devastation behind, because it was a powerful and ruthless army. Starhemberg knew he was outnumbered because the Ottoman army was much larger than his own, and he also knew that relief may never come because the Habsburgs were fighting on multiple fronts, and even if it did, because he was not sure if the relief army would arrive in time, and emissaries had been dispatched to the princes of the Holy Roman Empire, to the Pope, and to Poland requesting assistance, because the Habsburgs needed help and there were no assurances, because the Habsburgs were not sure if they would receive any help. And the third key player was King Jan III Sobieski of Poland, because he was a skilled military leader, and Sobieski was one of the greatest military leaders of his era, because he was a brilliant tactician, and he led the legendary Winged Hussars, because they were a powerful and well-trained cavalry unit, and heavy cavalry who had smashed opposing lines throughout Eastern Europe for years because they were a formidable force, and relations between Poland and the Habsburgs were complex because they had a long and complicated history. And Sobieski had his own political motives because he wanted to expand his own power. And nonetheless, he was confronted with a strategic truth that if Vienna were lost to the Ottomans, Poland would be the next target because the Ottomans would not stop at Vienna. Three men would decide the fate of Vienna and with it, much of the strategic future of Europe, because they were the leaders of the armies that fought in the siege, and Kara Mustafa, Starhemberg and Sobieski because they were the key players in the siege. And in early 1683 the Ottoman army set out from Constantinople because it was the start of the campaign, and according to contemporary accounts it numbered more than 150,000 soldiers, because it was a large army, and some sources claim that the total number of people, including camp, followers and support personnel, might have reached as high as 200,000 because it was a massive army. And in either case, this was one of the largest armies ever raised for a European campaign because it was a powerful and well-equipped army, and it marched through the Balkans and into Hungary because it was on its way to Vienna. And everywhere it went, it laid waste to the countryside because it was a ruthless army. And villages were torched and people were slaughtered or sold into slavery because the Ottomans were brutal, and property and provisions were confiscated or burned because the Ottomans wanted to destroy everything in their path. The campaign was intended not just to conquer land, but to instill terror and crush opposition because the Ottomans wanted to inspire fear in their enemies, and towns that resisted were annihilated because the Ottomans were ruthless, and those that surrendered were treated unpredictably because the Ottomans were unpredictable. And in June and July the Ottoman vanguard crossed into Austrian territory because they were on their way to Vienna, and refugees poured west, bringing news of devastation and atrocities because they were fleeing from the Ottomans. And the belief grew that this army was unstoppable because it was a powerful and ruthless army, and within Vienna alarm became hysteria because the people were afraid, and Emperor Leopold I abandoned the city because he wanted to save himself. And he left Vienna together with his court and most of the nobility in early July, taking the imperial treasury and as much property as they could carry with them because he wanted to preserve his own power. And the city was thus left to its garrison and civilian population because the emperor had abandoned them. Starhemberg had few troops available for the defence because the city was not well defended and no hope of significant reinforcements from elsewhere in the Habsburg domains in the foreseeable future, because the Habsburgs were fighting on multiple fronts and there were around 50,000 civilians within the walls, because the city was densely populated, and if the Ottomans captured the city, the fate of towns such as Perchtoldsdorf showed what would happen, because the Ottomans were ruthless, and on the 16th of July 1683 the Ottoman vanguard arrived at Perchtoldsdorf just south of Vienna, because it was on its way to Vienna, and the town capitulated because it was not well defended, and Kara Mustafa offered safe conduct because he wanted to avoid a lengthy siege, and the gates were thrown open because the town had surrendered, and what followed was a slaughter. Because the Ottomans were ruthless and thousands of men were massacred and women and children were taken into slavery because they were seen as spoils of war. And the town was razed because the Ottomans wanted to destroy everything in their path. The following day, July 17th, 1683, the main Ottoman force appeared before Vienna because it was the start of the siege, and the city was encircled because the Ottomans had surrounded it, and all avenues of escape or relief were effectively sealed because the Ottomans had cut off all escape routes, and the siege proper began because the Ottomans had started their attack. And Kara Mustafa dispatched a formal summons to Starhemberg, demanding that the city surrender in return for a pledge that the lives and possessions of the citizens would be respected, because he wanted to avoid a lengthy siege. And Starhemberg declined because he did not trust the Ottomans. And by name he referred to Perchtoldsdorf, because it was a recent example of Ottoman brutality, and there too the same pledges had been made, and the result had been massacre and captivity, because the Ottomans were ruthless, and for him Ottoman guarantees counted for nothing, because he did not trust the Ottomans, and surrender was not security, because it would not protect the city, and the only reasonable choice, on the basis of all known facts, was to hold out as long as one could, because it was the only way to resist the Ottoman army. On paper, the prospects looked grim because the city was not well defended, and Vienna had some 16,000 defenders because it was not well defended, and with over 150,000 men, the Ottomans also brought artillery, engineers and siege equipment because they were well equipped, and Vienna's only strength lay in its fortifications and the resolve of those defending them, because the city was well fortified. And the Ottomans were methodical in their siege tactics because they were well trained, and they did not make repeated, futile, frontal attacks because they were patient, and they had the men and the engineering skills to take their time because they were well equipped. And engineers dug trenches to approach the walls in zigzags to keep them under cover from the defending guns because they wanted to avoid taking casualties, and miners started digging under the bastions, planting explosive charges to blow up parts of the fortifications and create breaches for the infantry to attack because they wanted to break through the walls. Ottoman artillery bombarded continuously above ground because they wanted to weaken the walls, and the cannon fire was aimed at the walls and the city behind because they wanted to destroy everything in their path, and houses and churches were destroyed, and fires raged again and again because the city was being destroyed, and the noise and destruction did not stop because the siege was intense, and Starhemberg led the defence with an iron hand because he was a skilled military leader, and every breach in the walls had to be closed or strengthened immediately because the city was not well defended, and countermining actions were taken to discover and destroy Ottoman tunnels because the defenders wanted to resist the Ottoman army, and attacks on the breaches had to be beaten back, often in bloody, hand-to-hand fighting because the defenders were determined to resist. Everyone took part in the defence because the city was not well defended, and military personnel and civilians laboured together because they wanted to resist the Ottoman army, and men and women carried earth, stone and wood to fill in breaches because they wanted to repair the walls, and older children assisted with transporting supplies and performing menial chores because they wanted to help, and the objective was to restore what had been destroyed quicker than the besiegers could demolish it, because the defenders wanted to resist the Ottoman army. And in early August, the Ottomans exploded one of their principal mines because they wanted to break through the walls, and the blast shattered a portion of a bastion and hurled rubble and corpses high into the air because it was a powerful explosion, and Ottoman infantry immediately rushed forward to take advantage of the breach because they wanted to break through the walls. The fighting in the breach was fierce and hand-to-hand because the defenders were determined to resist, and the defenders prevailed because they were well led and well trained, and that night reconstruction of the breach section began at once because the defenders wanted to repair the walls, and this cycle continued for the rest of the siege because the defenders were determined to resist. A mine, explosion, assault, defence, repair, because it was a cycle of violence, and conditions within the city worsened over the summer, because the siege was intense and food supplies dwindled because the city was not well stocked and there was no hope of resupply while the city remained surrounded because the Ottomans had cut off all escape routes and rationing tightened. But hunger grew because the city was not well stocked, and disease ensued because the city was not well sanitized, and in the cramped, devastated quarters, dysentery and other fevers spread because the city was not well sanitized and wounds festered and hygiene ceased, because the city was not well sanitized and the death toll rose, and often corpses could not be swiftly buried or carted away because the city was not well organized. Ottoman snipers in the front-line trenches picked off anyone who appeared on the ramparts because they wanted to weaken the defenders, and cannon fire pounded the city because the Ottomans wanted to destroy everything in their path, and structures crumbled because the city was being destroyed, and whole swathes of the city were levelled because the Ottomans were ruthless, and Vienna was being ground into dust because the siege was intense, and yet the defenders still held on because they were determined to resist, and Starhemberg ordered periodic sorties because he wanted to weaken the Ottoman army, and small-scale offensive operations outside the walls because he wanted to attack the Ottoman army and to attack Ottoman siege works, destroy artillery and blow up tunnels because he wanted to weaken the Ottoman army, and these were risky and expensive because they were dangerous. But they delayed the siege and bought time because the defenders were determined to resist. By late August, the situation inside Vienna was desperate because the city was not well defended, and several breaches had been blown because the Ottomans had broken through the walls, and the garrison was worn out because the defenders were tired, and thousands of men lay dead, injured or ill, because the siege was intense, and supplies and ammunition were running low because the city was not well stocked, and only about a third of the initial defending army was still in full fighting condition because the defenders were weakened, and Kara Mustafa on the Ottoman side was convinced that the end was nigh because he thought the city was about to fall, and he made plans for one last decisive attack to finally overcome the remaining resistance because he wanted to take the city. But for the people within Vienna, one thing above all else dominated their thoughts, because they were afraid, and the events at Perchtoldsdorf, because it was a recent example of Ottoman brutality, and the knowledge of the assurances of security followed by slaughter and slavery, influenced their attitude towards the prospect of surrender, because they did not trust the Ottomans, and for them there was no genuine option of capitulation, because they did not trust the Ottomans, and only continued resistance and the chance of external relief offered any hope, because they were determined to resist, and Vienna could not save itself, because the city was not well defended, and salvation must come from outside the city walls, because the defenders were weakened. And before his departure, Emperor Leopold I had sent frantic appeals for help throughout Europe, because he wanted to save the city, and to the German princes, to the Pope, and to Poland requesting assistance because he wanted to save the city, and the message was clear because he wanted to save the city, and should Vienna fall, large parts of Christian Europe would be vulnerable to further Ottoman conquests, because the Ottomans were ruthless. Pope Innocent XI understood the consequences because he was a skilled diplomat, and if the Ottomans were able to take Vienna, the entire strategic position in Central Europe would change, because the Ottomans would be able to expand their empire. And he worked to organise a coalition to relieve the city, because he wanted to save the city, and he used diplomacy, money and religious authority to urge and compel secular rulers to commit troops, because he wanted to save the city, and it was presented as a defensive, religiously sanctioned war because he wanted to save the city, and the papacy supplied money and, in some cases, influence with reluctant princes because he wanted to save the city, and King Jan III. Sobieski of Poland was the first major ruler to respond favourably because he wanted to save the city, and he had compelling reasons of his own because he wanted to expand his own power. And a Turkish victory at Vienna would bring the front line of war closer to Polish territory, because the Ottomans were ruthless, and participation was an issue of strategic self-interest as well as religious and political calculation, because he wanted to save the city. It also gave Sobieski the chance to lead a major combined operation, because he was a skilled military leader, and Sobieski gathered his forces because he wanted to save the city, and including the elite Winged Hussars because they were a powerful and well-trained cavalry unit. And these heavy cavalry formations, numbering some 3,000 men, comprised the bulk of his mounted force, because they were a formidable force, and they were heavily armoured and drilled for shock action with lance and sword, because they were well trained. And Other German princes provided contingents too because they wanted to save the city, and troops came from Saxony, Bavaria, and various minor states because they wanted to save the city, and these were combined with the imperial forces under Charles of Lorraine because he was a skilled military leader and organised alongside the Polish army, because they wanted to save the city, and together they made up a relieving force of over 70,000 men, because it was a large and well-trained army. And this was fewer than the Ottoman force because the Ottomans were ruthless but substantial and well commanded, because the relieving army was well led. The coalition was not a straightforward demonstration of religious solidarity because the rulers had their own interests and political enmities and conflicting aims were always close to the fore. Because the rulers had their own interests, and in particular, France of King Louis XIV stood outside the coalition because he had his own interests, and Louis had his own grievances against the Habsburgs because he wanted to expand his own power and sometimes enjoyed an understanding with the Ottomans because he wanted to weaken the Habsburgs. And a debilitated Habsburg monarchy would serve French purposes because he wanted to expand his own power. And for all these differences, however, the relieving army assembled and set out for Vienna in late August because they wanted to save the city, and time was of the essence because the city was not well defended. And news from the city suggested that the siege was reaching crisis point because the city was about to fall, and the defenders were close to collapse because they were weakened, and any further delay of even a few weeks could render relief meaningless because the city was about to fall. By the beginning of September, the coalition army had reached the Vienna woods because they were on their way to the city and the wooded high ground to the west of the city because it was a strategic location. And from there, commanders could see the Ottoman camp, the siege works, and the city itself because they had a clear view. And Ottoman scouts spotted the approach of the relief army because they were vigilant, and Kara Mustafa had a decision to make because he was the leader of the Ottoman army, and he could break off the siege and mass his forces for an open field battle against the coalition because he wanted to defeat the relieving army, or he could continue the siege and try to defeat the relief force while maintaining pressure on the city because he wanted to take the city. He decided to continue the siege while also facing the coalition because he was confident in his own army and believing in his numerical superiority because he had a large army, and he expected to complete the reduction of Vienna and then fully face the approaching army because he wanted to take the city. And on the 11th of September 1683, the relief forces arrived at the Kahlenberg Heights overlooking Vienna because they were on their way to the city, and from there they could see the battlefield because they had a clear view, and the besieged city, the sprawling Ottoman camps, the lines of trenches, and the smoke rising from the devastated urban areas because the city was being destroyed. And at dawn on September 12th, the coalition assault began because they wanted to save the city, and the infantry of the Imperial and German contingents moved first because they were the vanguard and descending from the wooded slopes to face the Ottomans on the plain because they were on their way to the city, and they were met by Ottoman janissaries and cavalry because the Ottomans were well defended, and the fighting was fierce and protracted because the battle was intense. The Ottomans held firm and the coalition infantry gained only limited ground, slowly and with difficulty, because the Ottomans were well defended, and Sobieski kept his cavalry in reserve on the hills because he wanted to use them at the right moment, and some 20,000 horsemen were massed together because it was a large and powerful cavalry unit, and with the approximately 3,000 Polish Winged Hussars placed in the centre, because they were the best cavalry unit, and he did not send them into action straight away because he wanted to use them at the right moment, and he waited until the infantry battle had fixed and stretched the Ottoman lines because he wanted to use his cavalry to break through the Ottoman lines, and until the opportune moment came to deliver a decisive stroke because he wanted to win the battle. Fighting continued throughout the afternoon across a wide front because the battle was intense, and the Ottomans were now confronted by the defenders of Vienna behind them and the coalition forces attacking from the hills because they were surrounded, and their attention and strength were split because they were fighting on two fronts and Sobieski decided late in the afternoon that the time was right because he wanted to win the battle, and he gave the order for the cavalry to charge because he wanted to break through the Ottoman lines, and the cavalry came down from the Kahlenberg in successive waves because it was a powerful and well-trained cavalry unit, and in what has been called the largest cavalry charge in history because it was a massive and powerful charge, and the last wave, about 18,000 strong, was centred on the Polish Winged Hussars, led by Sobieski himself, because he was a skilled military leader, and the charge downhill increased the speed and momentum of the assault because the cavalry was well trained, and the Ottoman centre took the full impact because the cavalry was powerful, and the Winged Hussars, backed up by other cavalry units, hit hard with massed force because they were well trained, and at the same time German and Austrian cavalry assaulted the Ottoman flanks because they wanted to break through the Ottoman lines. The impact was devastating because the cavalry was powerful, and Ottoman units which had endured fierce combat throughout the day were now confronted by a full-scale cavalry charge because the cavalry was well trained. And as sections of the line started to break, localized withdrawals quickly snowballed into a full rout because the Ottomans were weakened, and panic ensued because the Ottomans were afraid, and Sobieski and his horsemen headed for Kara Mustafa's headquarters camp because they wanted to capture the Ottoman leader, and the Grand Vizier's bodyguards put up resistance because they wanted to protect their leader, but the Allied cavalry smashed through because they were well trained, and Kara Mustafa abandoned the battlefield, leaving behind his headquarters and most of his personal belongings because he was afraid. And with the fall of the central camp and the Grand Vizier's escape, Ottoman morale and cohesion collapsed because the Ottomans were weakened. Soldiers throughout the battlefield observed the collapse and reacted accordingly because they were afraid, and discipline collapsed into general flight because the Ottomans were weakened, and artillery, wagons, supplies, and baggage were abandoned on the flight paths because the Ottomans were in disarray. And coalition forces pursued the fleeing Ottomans, killing many more and capturing large amounts of material because they wanted to destroy the Ottoman army, and the siege lines and forward works surrounding Vienna were overrun because the Ottomans were weakened, and by nightfall the siege of Vienna was essentially finished because the Ottomans had been defeated, and the army which had seemed so overwhelming that morning was now in full flight because the Ottomans were weakened, and the consequences for Kara Mustafa Pasha were dire because he had lost the battle. He retreated with the remains of his army towards Belgrade because he wanted to escape, and heavy losses in manpower, artillery, equipment and prestige because the Ottomans had been defeated, and he had promised victory and the conquest of Vienna because he had been confident, and instead he brought about a great defeat because he had lost the battle. And the reaction of Sultan Mehmed IV was immediate because he was angry, and on December 25th, 1683, Kara Mustafa Pasha was hanged in Belgrade by strangulation with a silk cord because he had lost the battle, and the usual method for high officials condemned to death because it was a symbolic execution, and his head was cut off and sent to the Sultan as evidence because the Sultan wanted to make an example of him. In Vienna itself, the lifting of the siege was a cause for great celebration because the city had been saved, and after 2 months of bombardment, famine, plague, and constant threat, the inhabitants could at last venture out of cellars, shelters, and fighting positions because they were finally safe, and Sobieski rode into the city as the leader of the relieving army because he was a hero, and met with Starhemberg and the remaining survivors of the garrison because they were the defenders of the city, and Starhemberg, who had led the defence under great stress, had survived the siege because he was a skilled military leader, and the defenders, both soldiers and civilians, were given credit for having resisted the overwhelming forces besieging them long enough for the relief army to come because they had saved the city. The city they had defended was badly scarred because it had been destroyed, and many structures were destroyed or weakened because the siege had been intense, and streets were filled with rubble because the city had been destroyed, and signs and smells of death and destruction were everywhere because the city had been devastated, but the walls still stood because they were well built, and the community itself remained intact because the people had survived and Vienna had not been sacked because the city had been saved. And Ottoman casualties in the campaign were heavy because the battle had been intense, and exact figures vary by source, but tens of thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured during the siege and the subsequent retreat because the Ottomans had been defeated. The coalition captured artillery pieces, munitions, supplies, animals, and large amounts of plunder from the abandoned Ottoman camp, including some of Kara Mustafa's personal belongings, because they had won the battle. And the deeper impact of the defeat, however, was strategic, because the Ottomans had been weakened, and the failure at Vienna marked the high point of Ottoman expansion into Central Europe, because the Ottomans had been defeated, and until 1683 the trend had been one of Ottoman conquest, because the Ottomans had been expanding their empire, and after 1683 it was reversed because the Ottomans had been defeated, and in the years following the siege, the Habsburgs and their allies did not content themselves with lifting the siege because they wanted to take advantage of the Ottoman defeat, and under the umbrella of the Holy League, because it was an alliance of European powers and an alliance promoted by the papacy, because the Pope wanted to weaken the Ottomans, and they continued the war against the Ottomans because they wanted to take advantage of the Ottoman defeat. Habsburg armies, often in concert with other European powers, advanced eastward because they wanted to take advantage of the Ottoman defeat, and in the following 16 years they recovered most of Hungary, which the Ottomans had occupied for more than a century because the Ottomans had been defeated, and the war ended with the signing of the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 because it was a peace treaty. And by its terms, the Ottoman Empire surrendered Hungary, Transylvania, Croatia, and Slavonia to the Habsburgs because the Ottomans had been defeated, and it was one of the greatest territorial defeats the Ottomans had suffered in Europe because the Ottomans had been weakened, and after this point the Ottoman Empire entered a lengthy period of relative decline in its European territories because the Ottomans had been defeated, and no more large-scale campaigns into Central Europe were attempted to conquer Vienna or advance further into the German and Italian states because the Ottomans had been weakened. The apple of gold of Vienna would remain elusive because the Ottomans had been defeated, and for the Habsburgs the successful defence of Vienna and the territorial gains consolidated their position as the dominant power in Central Europe for the next 2 centuries because they had taken advantage of the Ottoman defeat, and Vienna itself emerged as both a major political capital and a symbol of resistance because it had been saved, and the city that resisted one of the largest armies ever assembled in Europe because it had been a great battle, and the siege and battle entered cultural memory because it was a significant event, and the charge of the Winged Hussars down the Starhemberg became one of the most iconic images associated with the siege because it was a heroic act. It was depicted in paintings and songs, and later in new media because it was a famous event, and many years later it continued to serve as a point of reference in debates on military history and popular images of the era, because it was a significant event, and numerous tales and legends emerged from the siege because it was a famous event, and the most enduring is known as the coffee legend, because it was a charming story, and this tale has it that when the Turks fled their encampment they left behind bags of coffee beans because it was a lucky discovery, and a Viennese man usually named as Franz Georg Kolschitsky, because he was a hero, and recognised the beans, took possession of them, and opened the first coffee house in the city because it was a new idea, and according to this account, Vienna's coffee house culture began immediately following the siege because it was a new tradition. It is a charming tale because it was a lucky discovery, and it connects an ordinary, everyday phenomenon, the consumption of coffee in a Viennese coffee house, because it was a new tradition, and with a spectacular historical event because it was a significant event, and it implies that a cultural institution emerged directly from a military encounter because it was a new idea. And yet the historical record does not bear out this simple story because it was not entirely true, and coffee was already available in Vienna prior to 1683 because it was not a new discovery, and it had arrived in Europe much earlier via trade with the Ottoman Empire and ports such as Venice, because it was a well-established trade, and people in Vienna already knew about coffee and how to prepare it, because they were familiar with it. The notion That the Ottomans brought coffee to Vienna exclusively by leaving behind provisions after the siege is false, because it was not entirely true, and it is perfectly conceivable that coffee was among the goods abandoned in the Ottoman encampment because it was a common commodity, and it was a big camp and contained many goods because it was a large army, and it was looted extensively after the battle because the coalition army was victorious. But this was not Vienna's first encounter with coffee because it was not a new discovery, and nor can the origins of its cafe culture be traced to one moment of discovery because it was a gradual process. The persistence of the coffee legend is a reminder that historical memory often favours clear, compact stories over more complex processes because it was a simple tale. And it gives a neat explanation for a familiar feature of Viennese life and ties it to a key moment in European history because it was a significant event, and that simplicity is appealing because it was a charming story. And even if it does not quite match up with the archival record because it was not entirely true, and in fact, Viennese coffeehouse culture emerged gradually over decades because it was a gradual process and shaped by trade, social practices, and cultural exchange, including contact with the Ottoman world, because it was a complex process. And the myth endures because it offers a vivid and accessible way to connect everyday experience today to a famous siege and its outcome, because it was a charming story.